Hello and a warm welcome back to Mortals and Motors. You join me in this episode with this, my 1983 Vauxhall Cavalier 1.6L. And this is of course a Mark II Cavalier which was launched in 1981, replacing the previous first generation rear wheel drive Cavalier. Now the Mark II was quite a big departure from the previous generation. This is front wheel drive and it's also available in a range of body styles. Saloon, classic of course, and this, the hatchback. There was also an estate which was launched a little bit later. It also came mated with a brand new overhead cam engine ready for the 1980s, originally launched for the Astra Cadet in 1979 and expanded to a 1.6 version as well, offered at launch in the Cavalier. And crucially for Vauxhall, this thoroughly modern package ready for the 1980s was launched a full year before Ford's Cortina replacement, the Sierra, came out in 1982, which allowed the Cavalier to reign supreme as the nation's favourite fleet car of the 80s. Having a look around the outside of the Cavalier, and it really is a 1980s motoring icon, isn't it? It was absolutely everywhere for a period of time, and sadly they have all but completely disappeared over the last 20 years. This particular car is practically launch spec because they hadn't really made very major revisions to the Cavalier by 1983. But Vauxhall did some really clever things with the Mark II during its life and gave it two major facelifts which kept it really fresh. The first one came in 1985 with mainly a revised interior but also some front and rear end improvements. And then in 1987, just as the model was about to be discontinued, the Cavalier got a final last-minute facelift of a new body-coloured front grille, which really did change the appearance and kept the Cavalier completely competitive right up until the very end of its production run. The styling of the Cavalier is really clever because it is very pin-sharp and 1980s, yet inside profile and particularly the saloon, it shares a real resemblance with the previous generation. I also do think that the rear end treatment for the hatchback has taken quite a bit of inspiration from the Rover SD1 of the 70s. I love the iconic kind of ribbing that's on a Mark II Cavalier, both on the bumper and on the rear light clusters. They are really quite something special. So this Cavalier is an L, which is one trim level up from base. There was a base Cavalier without a designation. You'll see the major differences with the base model is a few trim differences, different headrests and a different steering wheel in particular. But although this is only one up from base, you will see just in a moment that this is actually a pretty well-equipped car, which is why it was such a good seller. So let's have a look inside the Mark II Cavalier, and we have this classic sort of Vauxhall door handle. It is metal. It looks plastic because it's black, but it is in fact metal. Open that, and the doors are really quite heavy and chunky and solid, surprisingly so for a fairly lightweight 1980s car. I greeted with a fairly plain vinyl door card. Remember, this is a launch spec effectively model. The later trim revisions got different door cards, but this is how the original low spec door cards were like. Still very 70s, to be honest. This kind of pressed vinyl here, nice little pattern to it, but functional certainly. So we get a door pull, we get an armrest, we get a window winder, and we get a door pocket which is fairly spacious for a few bits and pieces, my mints in particular. Crucially, we also get an internally adjustable door mirror. And looking at the inside of the Cavalier, we are greeted with a bit of a sea of grey, and that brings me to one of my little criticisms of this particular car, and that is the colour. This is finished in China blue, or as a lot of people like to call it, Doom blue, which is a very 80s colour, but because of that, it is finished with a grey interior, trim on the cloth and the dashboard and the door cards. A green car would have a green interior, which I would much prefer. Red cars have red interiors, white cars have the kind of orangey red interiors, and I think you also get a beige one as well for certain colours of the cars. But yeah, the blue and grey combination is for me a little bit dull and too understated, but very popular and very, very ordinary for the 1980s, which is kind of exactly what I love to celebrate. So the seats of the Cavalier are quite big and supportive. They don't have a huge amount of side support. You'd expect that in maybe one of the sportier models, but it's trimmed in this lovely kind of tweed, which has got, if you zoom into it, you'll see it's kind of a checked pattern of black and grey and light grey. We also have this classic Vauxhall dashboard of the 80s, this kind of falling off the edge of a cliff style, which was really common in the Astra, the Nova, and of course the Cavalier, and I think even the bigger ones, the Carlton, etc. as well, all took this kind of theme of this cliff edge dashboard. So we are greeted initially with this instrument cluster. It is a very functional instrument cluster. Feels very 70s, to be honest, for a 1980s car. And again, that's one of the revisions that Vauxhall made over the life of the Cavalier, was to update the instrument cluster and keep it feeling really, really fresh. So by the mid 80s, it had a much more 80s vibe, whereas in 1981, it was still quite a 70s vibe to the world, and so this was perfectly adequate. It's really simple. So we have a speedometer in the centre with a trip computer, we have a fuel gauge, a couple of warning lights on the left hand side, a temperature gauge on the right hand side, and a few more warning lights again. To the right of the instrument panel we have the Vauxhall Classic light switch, which gives you your side lights in the middle, then your full lights on the right hand side, and then if you pull it out it turns on the courtesy light. Underneath the light switch we have the fog light switch, which just flips up like that. It's very kind of classic, I have to say. We also have lots of blanks there as well, denoting that this is a bit of a base model. On the stalks we've got wiper controls on the right hand side, we have intermittent and I think 2 speeds on the wipers, and a wash wipe facility which is automatic, so when you flash it, it will wipe and squirt at the same time. On the left hand side we've got the indicators left and right, and also we have the flashes for the headlight, and this is one of the ones I like because it is a pull for the main beams, which is rather wonderful. Don't like it when you have to push them away. Horrible. And of course mention has to be made of the classic 2-spoke Vauxhall 1980s steering wheel. Lower spec models got this 2-spoke, whereas the higher spec ones got a posher looking 4-spoke wheel, which I like far less than this boggo basic one. In the centre of the dashboard we've got a couple of air vents, and they are quite stylised, aren't they? They shape down with the dash there. They move about quite easily in all sorts of directions, but these are crucially fresh air vents. They don't give you heat into the cabin. The heat comes on the side ones, or the ones up to the windscreen, or the ones down to the floor. Underneath that we have a quartz clock. Of course, quartz was very important in the 1980s for some reason. And we have a radio. This is a Philips digital radio. It was actually an option on the Cavalier. It wasn't standard on the L. The L got, at this stage, a much more basic 2-knobbed manual tuning affair, but I've upgraded it to this optional radio because it's much easier to use digital tuning these days than the knobs, I find. Underneath the radio we have got the heater controls. So we have got over here cold and hot, which in a vertical pattern, which is kind of unusual. Most cars have them as rotary knobs. So that's cold down there and hot up there. Next to that we've got then the heat distribution. So we've got bottom heat distribution and top heat distribution, and they are separate. So you can move it from the screen to the vents and from the floor to the vents. So for maximum kind of flow into the cabin you'd have them in that setting, but if you wanted to defrost you'd have it over there, and if you wanted your feet, have it down there. Next to that is the knob for the fan speed. Then we've got the heated rear window, which again lifts up and that little telltale lights up, rather nifty. Hazard lights, and then that is a sound distribution for the speaker system, so you can it's a fader effectively, so front and rear, because yes, although this is an L, we still get rear speakers. And below all those controls we have of course an ashtray in classic form with a cigarette lighter. So L is pretty well equipped, I have to say, for 1983. And nestled just to the left of the steering column we have a manual choke. Now this car originally came with an automatic choke, but because of reliability reasons I have swapped it and fitted a manual choke conversion kit using a kit that was readily available in motor factors in the 1980s. Over on the passenger side we have quite a curved dashboard that kind of goes away from your legs, which means that the passenger gets a little bit more leg room, which is rather good. And we have quite a decent sized glove box, as you can see, with bits and pieces inside there, some hints of modernity and some tapes as well. Down in the middle of the car we've got a big centre console here, which is really useful for holding your period accessories such as your packet of cigarettes and your now tapes. Behind that we have a 4-speed manual gearbox, and it is a delight to use, I have to say. It's sprung and it flows so nicely into all the gears without any difficulty whatsoever. It also has a little collar that you lift in order to put it into reverse. Behind that we've got a ordinary manual handbrake, but it sort of twists really weirdly towards the driver's side of the car. Very odd, I have to say, sensation, but it works. It's sort of angled nicely for my hand. It just sort of looks really strange in the middle of the car that looks like it should be wrong, but it's not. Before I step into the back of the Cavalier, what I really wanted to get across in this video to you is what a quality product the Cavalier feels. So let's close this rear door, and it closes with such a solid, refined thunk. It's incredibly satisfying, I have to say, and definitely not what I was expecting. My Mark 1 Astra is much tinnier sounding than this. Same goes when you just open the door. It just feels quality. It feels heavy, you know, and the fabrics and the materials all feel like they are incredibly robust. Little touches like the window winder knob is rubberized, so it's nice to hold on to, and it has a really lovely light action, and also the glass goes all the way down to the bottom. How wonderfully 80s is that? There are other really high quality touches inside the car as well. So the headlining is this kind of 1980s perforated headlining as normal, but if you touch it and poke it, you'll find there's actually a load of sound insulation behind it, between the facing of the headlining and the roof, which is just not there on most 1980s cars. So it shows there's a huge amount of sound insulation in this car to make it a really refined package. And of course, who could forget my other favourite feature of the Mark II Cavalier, which is these retractable parcel shelf strings. I absolutely love that. That is a sign of a well-engineered quality car that has been really well thought out. So looking at the back of the Cavalier, we again have this kind of grey tweed upholstery. We also have some seat belts. These are GM branded seat belts, but they are not, in fact, as you can see, the correct seat belts for a Cavalier, because Cavalier seat belts would clip onto those little nubbins there on the seat, but at least they have been fitted, and that is certainly an improvement over absolutely nothing, which would be quite normal for the early 1980s. We also have, as you can see, a split rear seat, which is very posh, again, for a pretty base spec car. It's little details like this on pretty much the base spec Cavalier that really shows that Vauxhall were absolutely serious on conquering the British market once and for all in the 1980s by offering such a quality and versatile product. The story in the back of the Cavalier is fairly similar to the front. I've got loads of leg room, it's perfectly comfortable and decent in here, and I'm sitting up reasonably high, so I have a reasonably good view out of the front of the car. The only difficulty is that this headrest is quite large. The base model, which came with a plastic A-frame headrest, would have probably given a little bit more light to rear passengers, but really it's not a place that you feel uncomfortable, and there's nothing to complain about. Behind the passengers we have this kind of rather large black parcel shelf in this hatchback, and this does lift up to give you access to the boot for rear passengers. So if you were storing, I don't know, picnics or something like that in there, you could kind of sneak in there and grab your snacks. And just like the rest of the car, this rear parcel shelf is supremely well constructed, feels unbelievably solid and quality, which really is the theme of this car for me. Let's have a look inside the boot of this hatchback Cavalier, and we have a lock that is a twisty one, so we twist it to the side, release it, and lift the hatch on its big powerful gas struts, which lift up the parcel shelf on those lovely retracting cords that I showed you a moment ago. And it reveals a really big spacious boot. Actually, there is a huge amount of space in here for an awful lot of stuff. I've got a picnic blanket and an awful umbrella and some accessories that are typical from the 1980s, such as a margarine tub to hold your first aid kit, and this amazing 1970s or 60s rug that the previous owner had put in the car and has probably been there since the car was new, and I just can't quite bring myself to take it out. There's also a boot light, which is activated by this little switch. What there isn't on this rear end that is normal to most Cavaliers is here there would be a reservoir for the rear wiper, because this car, this early on, the L doesn't get a rear wiper. Later Ls do, and they park at different sides depending on the age of the Cavalier, but yeah, an L at this age is rear wiperless. Although the boot is very big, it is not without some criticism, and that criticism is the very high load lip. You'll see it goes right up above the number plate and the lights here, which means that if you've got big bulky objects, suitcases that are full, if you're going on holiday, that kind of thing, you've got a great big lip to get them over, which is a bit of a faff, I have to say. Hatchbacks at the time were a new invention, I suppose, and they were a little bit treated with suspicion. So I suspect that that high lip was there as a compromise to help the body shell rigidity. Let's take a look under the bonnet. The release is here on the driver's side. Pull that. And here we are. This is the 1.6 version of the Vauxhall Family 2 overhead cam engine that was introduced in 1979. It was originally as a 1.3 for the Cadet, but this has been brought out to being a 1.6. Now, it is an excellent engine that provides 90 horsepower, which is a huge amount of horsepower for the 80s from a 1.6 litre engine. And it is an incredibly smooth engine. It runs really, really nicely, and it pulls very strongly as well. It feels much more like a 1.8 than a 1.6, which is what a lot of road tests at the time of the launch of the Cavalier said. As you can see underneath this bonnet, it is all very conventional and has a really good access to everything. We've got the brake system over there with the servo. The servo did move for later Cavaliers to over the other side of the engine bay, I believe. We've got the distributor at the end of the camshaft, which is very classic for the Vauxhall engines. It is a cross-flow engine as well, so we've got the inlet on the rear, the exhaust on the front, and the exhaust kind of goes underneath the engine. We have electronic ignition, which is in a module underneath the coil there, which makes it all super reliable and very easy to live with. So what is this Mark II Cavalier like to drive on the road? Well, the overriding impression really is one of a lot of smoothness and a lot of refinement, to be honest. The engine pulls really well in all the gears. Pull away from the lights. Got a long first up to 20, then we're in second, up to about 36, 37 miles per hour, change to third. Nice acceleration, you know, it feels good, it feels gutsy. That's the thing, it feels gutsy and powerful. Right, let's have a gear change check. Smooth, nice, and glides into second there, and then we just have, actually glides nicely into third as well. It is actually really good. The steering as well is super direct and precise. But it's also not too heavy, particularly at parking speeds. You know, you can park it without having to have Popeye arms, which is a real testament to how they have managed to get the gearing right on the steering rack. It's really good. Brakes are decent. Yeah, they're not as sharp as some other cars that I've driven, but they work. And I suppose that ultimately is the main thing. They don't have the best feel. So the ride of the Cavalier is really smooth, I have to say. It's quite comfortable without being too rolly. The Mark I Astra I have, which shares an awful lot of components with the Cavalier, is a bit firmer than this in terms of its ride. It's more sporty, whereas this is just that little bit more kind of composed and comfortable as a long distance cruiser, I suppose. All of the minor controls are nice and easy to use, and they're really to hand because of the way that Vauxhall designed this dashboard. So if I want to put the heater fan on, I just need to do that, move my hand about 10 centimetres and it's done. And it's all super intuitive as well. Everything is exactly where you expect it to be, you know, heat there and distribution and whatever. Right, let's open her up and go down a slip road onto a dual carriageway and see what this 1.6 90 horsepower baby can do, eh? We're in third, going to just under 60 miles per hour, and now we're in fourth, which is top gear, and we are just going to merge onto the dual carriageway, now doing just under 70 miles an hour in fourth gear, and it's one of the only cars I have ever driven with a 4-speed gearbox where you just don't need a fifth. Like, it's absolutely fine. Just pulls, look at that, I'm just pulled out behind this lorry. It was doing about 55 and now we're doing 70. It has so much power and smoothness, particularly at cruising speeds like this. It cruises pretty effortlessly at between 60 and 70 miles an hour in fourth gear, and it's not screaming. That's the thing. I've driven so many other 4-speed cars from the 80s and early 90s where by the time you get to 70 miles an hour, the engine is really kind of going, no, give me a fifth. But this isn't. This is absolutely fine. It's kind of refined, it's comfortable, it's not noisy in the cabin either, is the thing. So the engine noise is there, you can hear it, but it's not kind of all-encompassing all around the cabin. It doesn't feel like the car is at the edge of the limits of what it can do. You know, I am now doing 70 in the fast lane of the A14, passing lorries, passing cars. It feels like a modern car. It's got punch, it's got guts, it's got confidence in a way that a lot of 80s cars don't necessarily have these days compared to, you know, the size and the power of modern cars. It does have a bit of tyre roar, but otherwise interior cabin noise is really pretty low, I have to say, for an 80s car, particularly when you've got the radio on. You know, you can hear the radio really comfortable, you can have a conversation with your passengers. There are many other cars, like the Volvo 340s in particular, where if you try and have a conversation with a passenger, you are kind of shouting, because the engine noise is just so present all the time, whereas the noise that's there in this car is just, it's got everything. You know, there's a bit of tyre, bit of engine, bit of wind noise, all of which is really very damped and controlled. This must have been such a revelation when it came out in 1981 compared to other things that were on the market. It, as a family, bog standard, large family car or fleet car, it is so well made, so refined, so smooth in terms of its power delivery, in terms of its ride. There's just none of that harshness and rawness that you often get in 80s cars. Well, that's it. I hope that you've enjoyed this little hero worship of my Mark II Cavalier, and that you've hopefully got a bit of a sense of what it's actually like to sort of touch and feel and to live with and to drive this car. It gives you a little bit of a flavour of it. It's a great car. I really like it. You might just about be able to tell. Anyway, all that remains for me to say is thank you ever so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video driving something else. Bye.